This is Radio Now 95.3 FM. Come for the news, stay for informed conversations.
President Bola Ahmed Tinubu has written to the National Assembly with a request to borrow 1.17 trillion naira from external sources in order to finance the deficit in the 2024 budget. This loan, if approved, will see a rise in Nigeria's debt profile from the 134.3 trillion naira recorded by the Debt Management Office in the second quarter of this year. Joining us to discuss the numbers involved in this conversation is Samuel Oyekomi, a Research and Insight Associate at Northern Berger. Mr. Oyekomi, good morning and thank you for joining us on the conversation.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Right. To speak to these numbers, we are going to see an increase in what is our current external debt profile by at least another 1.17 trillion naira. I wonder if you can speak to us as a start about Nigeria's GDP to debt conversation. How well are we doing in terms of paying back our external loans?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. Seen a significant rise in Nigeria's debt profile recently, but of course, not to say that we're not meeting our debt obligations. Our debt is going around 51%, an increase from a lot of 42% last year. Debt servicing has also increased significantly as a result of high external debt payment. One again from excess devaluation. So currently that's where we are, and further increase in or further accumulation of debt means that debt stock continues to rise if our economy is not growing at the same or even faster margin. It means that that debt to GDP ratio could find itself in the north of 60 or over 60%, and that's not a good number when you look at it on paper. So yes, those are worrisome numbers, but do we need debt to finance our budget deficit of over 7 trillion? Yeah, most definitely.
So, the Debt Management Office has continued to say that, we're well within the legal means. It's not time to lose our heads just yet about our ballooning debt profile. Yet, the issue goes back to how, even if we're taking new loans every year, it doesn't seem like our revenue sources are really matching up. And even in cases such as this year where we've improved revenue generation to some degree, the trouble is that the value of the naira continues to decrease. At what point do you think we should be concerned about our debt profile?
Well, I don't think anyone can speak specifically to when we should be worried, because I don't think anyone really wants to put Nigerians on the pressure. I think they have enough pressure on that. But the numbers are not friendly. I know that the government is also doing a bit with some reforms as to improve revenue generation, particularly from the tax side of things, and if there can be some form of fiscal diligence in terms of how we spend and areas that we spend. Maybe there could be some improvement in our fiscal numbers. But it is very important that even when we want to borrow, we don't have a situation whereby we're borrowing a huge chunk of our fiscal influence, because what it also means is that you will be spending a huge part of that money on debt servicing. I even saw one of the analysis in the week that debt servicing in the next 3 to 5 years is more than the capital expenditure, and I don't think any economy wants to work that way, because capital expenses or capital projects are one of those things that would help drive economic growth in the nearest future. We need to find a way to bring down our debt exposure, and the only way that's going to be done is either we are a little bit more diligent in our spending, reduce our spending, which is some of the things that the government has done since this administration. Unfortunately, that is not really having so much impact on our fiscal numbers. And the other ways to improve revenue, yes, tax is one of them. Improving crude exports is also one of them. But we really need to get our acts together and to be able to improve revenue and maybe shrink that deficit, so that we're not so much exposed to borrowing. But then again, borrowing also has its own negative impact somehow on the economy.
So I'm looking at, if you look at the DMO's numbers for our domestic debt, right? It stands at 65.6 trillion naira. In dollar terms, that's about $46 billion or so. Now, we expect that, I believe it was the Minister of Finance, he was at a meeting recently where he was talking about Nigeria's high interest rates at the moment. But also, we've heard the IMF, the Bretton Woods institutions, saying that we need longer monetary tightening policies. So by the time the CBN's MPC sits, I think that's this month or so, some people expect that they will raise interest rates once again. We've been thinking about it in terms of local businesses, but what does it really mean for the federal government and its ability to source these funds within Nigeria?
Yeah, of course, we've been maintaining high interest rate environment for a while now. I think this year we've seen over 50 basis points increase in the MPR, and then the government has pretty much increased rates by which they borrow domestically and even externally. If they can pay back, of course, domestic loans or domestic debts are easier part of the pie. You can always recycle. So oftentimes you notice that an auction when there is a maturity, so you tend to borrow and pay back. And I don't think that should be so much cost for worry. And don't forget, when you look again into our numbers, money supply is over 100, I think around over 120 trillion. That's huge. That's huge money supply. Huge significant increase. When you compare them to, let's say, like 3 years ago, currency in circulation over 4.1 trillion. It is just so much money moving around in the economy. And for a reason, the CBN has to find a way to mop some of this excess liquidity. My own concern is just that since the CBN are still on this hawkish tightening stance, money supply has not seemed to reduce. It still continues to reach forward. And one major component there is also the FX speed of it, where you have the net domestic assets and then net foreign assets. So that is also there. But the fact remains that broad money supply is not declining. And if you're increasing interest rates as a bid to curb some form of supply, demand side inflation, and money supply is still raging higher, then that becomes a problem. But I do believe, I do not seem to worry that the government will be able to pay back domestic or service domestic debt. They can always find a way around it. It's local economy. The concern would be external debt, because there you have to source for effect to be able to meet some of the debt obligations.
So back in September this year, we had our first ever domestic dollar bond. The initial aim was to raise $500 million. We went past that and got to $900 million. Now, this is roughly about 1.5 trillion naira as new borrowing. I wonder how these figures will continue to affect our ability to pay back. I know you said there's not too much to worry about, but we've seen 50 trillion naira borrowed over the course of the last 19 months. We've also seen our debt to GDP ratio go past 50% during this time as well. I wonder if you can speak to us about where we start to pay back these loans and where we can sort of balance out so that we're not paying using too much of the money that we've raised internally or our revenue to pay back the loans that Nigeria currently has.
Yeah, very valid question. Yes, there's a worry that we keep accumulating debt, borrowings, and we could have issues paying them. And I think what the government is just trying to do is let's solve problems right now, and then they want to be like a going concern on a going basis, stuff that. But I don't think Nigeria has done 50 trillion so far this year. So the increase in our debt profile in recent times, it has a huge part of it is FX back. So don't forget, just about 3 years ago, our FX was around naira to dollar was around 44. Now it's particularly last year, and right now we're seeing it north of 1,650, 1,680. That's like 4 pool the exchange. So that literally balloons external debt figures on according to the PMO. And so when you look at that, you tend to understand that 134, 1.7 trillion that we see now was largely driven by the FX devaluation. Of course, there are huge borrowings because government has ramped up significantly even this year with domestic borrowing. Now, we did be able to pay back the local currency part. I tend to not worry about that, but because, of course, they are always find a way. My problem is, or my worry would be the FX. And yes, the local the dollar-denominated bonds that was raised by Nigeria this year will be paid back also in dollars. But of course, they have some form of periods to maturity, and the belief is also that some of these policies will have been able to crystallize and benefited us positively. And don't forget, our national reserve has seen some huge inflows, and I've seen it around over $40 billion dollars right now. So possibly that's the hope. But again, there is always a need to worry how we're going to pay back loans at some point in the future, and that's something that we just watch and see.
Just finally, Mr. Yekome, instructively, this is for funding, essentially plugging the deficit gap in our 2024 budget. We already have an idea of what the 2025 budget would be. From the borrowings we've done so far, expectations are that we're likely to extend the performance of the 2024 budget into next year. By how much, I don't really know. Not many people can say just yet. What sort of lessons should we be drawing from 2024's performance ahead of 2025?
Key learnings. One of them is the inflows past revenue side of the fiscal numbers, and then the other bit also is the expenses part. In terms of revenue, governments really need to find a way to ramp up inflows. I know that earlier in the year there was policy around CBN banks paying the windfall tax on their FX gains. That's one way, but that's not sustainable. But the windfall for a reason is one time. We need sustainable revenue generation for the government, and we have so far for a long time relied on crude exports. But again, that is just due to shock in the market. The government is setting the budget at $75 per barrel. But anything could happen. The wars in the Middle East and Russia and all would just change the direction of crude oil, and then we find ourselves in a limbo again. In terms of spending, capital, recurrent debt servicing, we tend to pay. I think there was an analysis some years back where the federal government is literally using the entire revenue to pay to service debt. And I don't think that's sustainable, because it means that if you use the entire money to service debt, then you are taking new borrowing to do your capital expenditure and then your recurrent expenditure.
Right.
So it means your fiscal deficit continues to expand. So the government really needs to do that, fighting some areas around the recurrent side of things, cost of governance and all that. And maybe we could find ourselves in better territories next year.
Mr. Oyekome, thank you very much for your time and your expertise on the conversation. Samuel Oyekome is a Research and Insight Associate at Norimberga, and he joined us this morning to speak on Nigeria's debt profile. With President Bola Ahmed Tinubu requesting to borrow another 1.17 trillion naira from external sources, Nigeria will see her debt profile rise to $136.3 trillion, 0.3 trillion naira, according to information out of the Debt Management Office.
This is Radio Now 95.3 FM. Come for the news, stay for informed conversations.